Hello, in this, our third lesson, we're going to be looking at the democratic initiatives that the EU has taken to try and make itself more democratic in the sense of voting, effectively, of input legitimacy. But before we consider these democratic initiatives, perhaps the more important question is, do we need democratic initiatives? The first question is, what sort of standard should we hold the EU to? Now, I'll go through three different standards. The first is that democracy doesn't really matter in the EU because the EU isn't about democracy. In fact, the EU is trying to shield itself from democracy. And this is the whole rationale behind the Commission, which is that the EU should be judged on the laws it puts out and not the input from the people into those laws. It follows that the EU should exist free from voting because voting can lead to short-term concerns being considered more important than long-term ones. It can lead to fascism and the persecution of minorities. This is the logic behind shielding the EU from popular democracy. And then on the other end of the spectrum, maybe we should say that the EU should be as democratic as a nation state. The idea is that the EU increasingly is creeping into areas of policy which have been the hallmark of the nation state, particularly crime and fiscal policy. Basically, if the EU is behaving like a state, and we say that states should have a certain level of democracy, logically it's the case that the EU should also be held to those high democratic standards. And this would lead to, for example, a very strong European Parliament or a pan-European democracy. In the middle, though, there is the idea of democracy, and this really stems from the EU not quite being a state, so we shouldn't hold it to the same level that we might hold a nation state, but also recognizing that we can't simply throw democracy to the wind. And democracy is about the idea of there being plural demoses, but plural being demoi. And a demos is a group of voters. So it views the EU as a collection of 27 or 28 demoi. So 27 or 28 groups of voters, democratic citizens, which need to be protected. It's all about the idea of the EU respecting the space of each member state to exist, make its own laws, and overall retain sovereignty. So these are the different kind of ideas that we can have for the EU's democracy. And ultimately, if you argue that the EU does not need any democracy at all, even though I might hypothetically think that it needs to have the same level of democracy as a nation state, we're both effectively right. We're just thinking in different terms. So there is a lot of room here for debate, and it's a very good debate. Now, putting that big question to one side, I'm going to examine three different initiatives which have been taken to try and increase what we call input legitimacy, the typical sort of democratic legitimacy that we see on the level of the nation state, people going out to vote, that sort of thing. Now, starting off, it is important to consider that the EU already has elections. It has European Parliament elections. The first initiative I'll speak about is a way of really trying to spice up these European Parliament elections, and it's the idea of Spitzenkandidaten. And in order to really assess Spitzenkandidaten, you need to understand why, or rather how, the presidents of the EU are elected. So the president of the Commission is suggested by the European Council and then elected by the European Parliament. The idea behind this is obvious. It shares power throughout institutions, so no one institution can be too powerful. Now, the idea of Spitzenkandidaten was that the European Parliament unilaterally said, look, European Council, we are only going to appoint the leader of the party with the most votes in the European Parliament elections. In simple terms, what the European Parliament said is this: we are going to take the European Parliament elections and we're going to add another element to them. So not only were citizens voting for their party in the European Parliament, but they were also voting for the President of the Commission. The role as President of the Commission is an interesting one, because in theory, there might be some sort of role in swaying the direction of the EU. If everyone votes for left-wing parties, maybe the idea is that by having a left-wing President of the Commission, they'll be able to sway things. This is difficult largely because we need to bear in mind the role of the Commission. The Commission is supposed to be apolitical. And so some academics have suggested maybe we're tacking on the wrong presidency to the EP elections. Maybe we should tack on the European Council presidency. This is a presidency which is inherently political because the European Council is not apolitical like the Commission is. But in any case, we see that Spitzenkandidaten hasn't quite gone as planned. It's useful to consider the first attempt at the Spitzenkandidaten experiment. So this is when Jean-Claude Juncker was elected president of the Commission. The reason why this was not a very good test of the effectiveness of this initiative was that Jean-Claude Juncker was the president, was the favourite of the council anyway. So even if, so the theory goes, even if the EP hadn't made this grandstanding announcement, the European Council would have put forward Juncker anyway. So it's quite hard to tell whether or not the council had listened to the EP and said, this is a great initiative, let's go on with it, or whether they just did what they were going to do anyway. And it seems recent news suggests that actually it was more the case that the council just disregarded Spitzenkandidaten and did what they wanted to do anyway. Now, we see this because the leader of the winning party, the European People's Party, Manfred Weber, is not going to be the president of the Commission. And this is because the European Council doesn't like him. So as soon as the tiniest bit of pressure has been put on this process, it's fallen apart. And this, we need to see how things develop, but it seems as though this might be the death of Spitzenkandidaten. However, the idea seems to make sense. It's making these elections, direct elections, more exciting and encouraging people to go out and vote, to take up opinions, to argue with one another, to, I don't know, pin up posters of European politicians in your bedroom, whatever. The idea was to encourage contestation and debate, and it's hard to say now whether or not it was successful. Moving on to the second initiative, we have the involvement of national parliaments. And it's useful at this stage to introduce you to the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is relatively straightforward. It's the idea that when national parliaments signed the European treaties, they said to the EU, you can make law in this, and this area, but we retain the right, in some cases, an exclusive right to choose our crimes, manage fiscal policy, so on and so forth. So subsidiarity is essentially the act of drawing a line between what the EU is supposed to do and what is still supposed to be done at the national level. So national parliaments are almost undisputably the biggest losers of European integration, because when we look at where the power of the EU has been taken from? It's been taken from national parliaments. So national parliaments have had their powers taken and moved to Brussels. And so it seems important to include national parliaments in the EU for two reasons. One, they need to be kept on side in that they have plenty of reasons to be quite annoyed at the European project. It means they're less powerful. But secondly, they have a very strong sense of democratic legitimacy. They are the symbol of democracy in each of the respective member states. And so the way that the EU has tried to do this is they have set up the early warning mechanism. So when the EU is passing a law, it sends a copy of the bill to the national parliaments and says, look guys, if you see the EU is stepping on your toes, you can vote and certain things will happen. So if a third of national parliaments vote and say, EU, you're stepping on our toes, effectively the Commission has to review it. But the Commission can also say, tough luck, we're totally fine, and move on with it. And that this is considered a yellow card. Alternatively, the national parliaments can muster up enough votes, specifically half of all national parliaments must flag up subsidiarity, and then the more serious kind of sanction comes in. And this is the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament must review it. If you've watched my second lesson, you'll see why this isn't actually much for sanction at all. It's simply what is going to happen anyway. It's a draft bill. It's going to be seen by the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament anyway. So it seems as if this whole system, with this sanction being called an orange card, it seems like orange and yellow cards aren't really much for sanction. And even if they were good sanctions, we need to ask ourselves whether or not it should be national parliaments policing subsidiarity. National parliaments, sure, have given their power away, but they still have plenty to do with regards to governing on a national level. And so maybe they don't have time to be reviewing EU draft bills. Indeed, it seems kind of pointless asking them, because even if national parliaments all said we're not happy with it, who cares about what national parliaments say? The national parliaments are not integrated into the OLP. The only people who are integrated into the OLP are government ministers. And if the ministers are fine with it, then it will pass as a draft bill. This is the point of the EU. It was taking power from national parliaments and giving it to the EU. So maybe national parliaments shouldn't be involved in this way at all. And finally, I'll briefly look at the European Citizens Initiative. Now, this initiative basically works as follows. You need 1 million signatures from citizens across seven member states saying that they want a certain issue looked at. It might be water pollution, it might be climate change, whatever. So if 1 million citizens across 7 member states sign this petition, the Commission has to consider it. The Commission is under no obligation to create a draft law or to pass the law. All they have to do is just consider it. And historically, they've considered all of the few initiatives to get enough signatures and said, no thank you, we don't want to sue them. And so that is problematic in and of itself, but it's also worth interrogating whether or not this is effective with regards to actually giving citizens a voice. Bearing in mind that it needs to be 1 million citizens across 7 member states, generally speaking, the only bodies which can amass this amount of support are NGOs such as churches. And so, in reality, the European Citizens Initiative seems to be, on the face of it, giving the opportunity for NGOs to suggest laws rather than citizens themselves. But then we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, in that the requirements are there to make sure there is a consensus, but the only bodies which are large enough to record this consensus will often not be organic groups of citizens. And this is effectively the problem which is striking at the heart of the European Citizens Initiative. Maybe it's the case that, having reflected upon the first question, you think all of this is nonsense anyway and it's a waste of time, and the reason why it hasn't been especially effective is because none of this matters, and actually we need to judge the EU based on the laws made by its experts. But the successes and the failures of these initiatives are important to help us consider how, if we do want to make the EU more democratic, how we're going to go about doing it. It seems to be a very tricky task, and one which I've no doubt will be the subject of debate for a very long time, especially as the EU delves into increasingly sensitive topics. If you like the video, I'd encourage you to like it. I'll post a picture of this and some notes in the description, and I hope to see you next time.